Welcome to Solutionary Rail Stakeholder Perspectives, a new interview series featuring Solutionary Rail stakeholders as well as current and potential allies. I'm Diane Wittner. My co-host is Bill Moyer. Tonight our guest is Jim Heneghan, the Renewable Energy Engineer at the Delta-Montrose Electric Association, or DMEA, which is a rural electric cooperative in western Colorado. We asked Jim to speak with us because he has brought renewable energy to DMEA. In the book Solutionary Rail, we suggest that rural electric co-ops could play a vital role in decarbonizing rail travel. The Netherlands, for instance, utilizes renewable energy, and yes, it's wind power, for electric rail travel for passengers. And here in the United States, 75% of our landmass receives electricity from rural electric co-ops, which is equal to about 11% of total sales and electricity nationwide. So Jim Heneghan's work and tonight's interview with him is timely. Jim, tell us your story and explain some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities ahead for DMEA and for rural electric co-ops and renewable energy. That's a big subject, and we'll get more specific as we go.
Sure. Thank you, Diane. So the DMEA story is largely one of a relatively small rural electric cooperative that serves 2 counties and a portion of a 3rd county in western Colorado. We have something on the order of 35,000 meters that we serve in present day. And we've gone through periods of growth that were largely driven by residential growth and some commercial and industrial growth as well. And since the 2008 recession, we've remained flat and perhaps even in decline to some extent in terms of some of the various rate categories that we serve. But throughout the time that I've been at DMEA, and I've been at DMEA for a little over 11 years, there have been board members that come and go. We're a rural electric cooperative, so we're governed by an elected board, as most of you on the call are probably aware. And what I have, I guess, been a little bit fascinated by is we are in an area of Colorado that might be considered conservative politically, and renewable energy and its implementation has, unfortunately, and sometimes become a partisan political issue, to my dismay. Yet, nevertheless, here in western Colorado, we've got a couple of county area where our membership in the cooperative and our leaders and the board of directors have consistently looked to do 2 things, and that is develop local resources for electricity generation when feasible. And there's been a big push and demand for renewable electricity, I think in large part driven by the fact that we have renewable resources in large extent in both small hydro, biomass, and solar electric generation. So the story at DMEA is one of perhaps an unlikely location for there to be, I think, a significant push among rural electric cooperatives for the ability to get more renewable electricity generation on our grid. And what that's resulted in is a few things. We, like many distribution cooperatives, which is to say that we typically purchase electricity from wholesalers and distribute to the retail consumer. In our case, the consumer is a member of the cooperative. So we were historically just purchasing power that was supplied by the wholesaler, and I would say perhaps not a great deal of attention given to what the resource was that was generated by that wholesale supplier. Most attention probably given to price, because consumers everywhere tend to be concerned with the price of their electricity. And then probably starting, in the 90s, but certainly picking up steam in the early part of the 2000s, a lot of attention was paid to what resources we do have. Our wholesale contract at the time, late 90s, early 2000s, had a provision that restricted the amount of electricity that we could generate on our own as a distribution co-op. It restricted it to 5%. And there was over the course of a few years, there was a great deal of discussion between us and our generation and transmission supplier over how we could expand beyond the 5%. And a challenge was issued by our board of directors at the time that these discussions were occurring to say, well, we haven't actually fulfilled our 5%, so why don't we go out and find local resources that we can develop that at least cap us in the 5% and continue the discussion with our G&T in talking about ways we could expand beyond the 5%. And so in essence, what happened was we did a little bit of solar. It was community solar that we started with. And we were, because of a resource assessment that we had done, we were aware that probably the most likely potential we could go tap to be renewable with our 5% limit was small hydro. And the small hydro that I'm referring to does not impound water in our case. We happen to be, and much of the West is in this condition, we're in an arid area. We do have agriculture as a significant part of our local economy. And as a result, we have a great deal of irrigation infrastructure that's already been put in place. One of the largest projects happens to be a U.S. Bureau of Reclamation facility referred to as the Compadre project, the Compadre Valley being where we live, and the Compadre River happening to run through a portion of our service area. And way back in 1904, when the Bureau of Reclamation was formed, one of the first 4 projects that it took on happened to be the Compadre project. A keystone of that project was a nearly 6-mile-long tunnel that was excavated to bring up to 1,300 cubic feet per second of water from what's referred to as the Gunnison River Basin to the Compadre Basin. This is the kind of cross-river diversion that I don't think would typically be met with a great deal of acceptance by a variety of groups, environmental groups, ecologically minded groups, sportsmen's groups, because we're diverting water, the project is, from the Gunnison River to the Compadre River. And that poses a host of environmental impacts and ecological impacts. Nevertheless, in the early 1900s, that wasn't a consideration. What was the driving factor was the ability to get irrigation water into a valley that was ripe for agricultural development. The result of that project, it was completed in 1909, was in addition to the nearly 6-mile-long tunnel, a 16-mile-long canal to carry what today is typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,100 cubic feet per second at the height of irrigation season, then goes through a host of additional canals, laterals, and other diversions to serve approximately 80,000 acres that are irrigated. And interestingly enough, the project was significant enough, in part being an initial project from the newly formed Bureau of Reclamation, that it drew the attention of, at the time, President Taft, who was brought out to Montrose to inaugurate the project and the opening of the tunnel. And the New York Times covered the story, among others. And in the New York Times article, as has been archived and I've read, the recognition of this infrastructure, the canals, in essence, to be able to produce hydroelectricity was mentioned in the article. And in fact, if I recall correctly, and I may not have the quote quite correct, but they in essence recognized that there could be enough hydroelectric generation to have potential to power the entire valley's needs. Now, bear in mind, we were talking 1909 when electricity was not as prevalent as it is today. But nevertheless, there are a host of topography points along the canal that do have significant elevation drop. And then when you're moving as much as 1,100 cubic feet per second of water, the kinetic energy that's available is significant. So that resource being somewhat well located for power line infrastructure and having great power potential is where we decided to start in trying to achieve renewable generation that could meet this 5% limit that we had. And so in 2012, we went through a process, which is a permitting process to get your hydro plant constructed. In this case, it's referred to as a lease of power privilege because it's through the Bureau of Reclamation. It's not a typical Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or FERC project. And dealing with the Bureau, we go through a similar process, stuff that many people today that are listening may be familiar with, where you have an environmental assessment, you have scoping meetings, and it's a public process. As an aside, this process in existing irrigation infrastructure has been much streamlined today, and I think in large part because of what we did in our initial project that started construction in 2012. But having fulfilled the EA requirements, environmental assessment requirements, gone through the scoping meeting, we did get the okay to construct 2 plants along this South Canal. That is the canal that's fed by the Gunnison Tunnel. The first plant, as you work downstream, is a 4 megawatt plant. By hydro standards, that's definitely considered small hydro. The next plant, about 1.5 miles downstream, is a 3.5 megawatt plant. Now, those 2 plants' output is available with a varying flow of irrigation water, generally speaking, somewhat smaller in the springtime when the irrigation needs first begin, peaking through the months of typically May, June, July, and August, and then a declining water flow that generally happens in September and October. So late March to early November is kind of the season during which the water is diverted. So it's not a full 12 months of generation, which further offered challenges in constructing these plants. Even though there's no dam construction, there is a fair amount of civil works that goes into it that requires a fair amount of capital. It's a capital-intensive project to build. Low operating costs, of course, because you're not paying necessarily for fuel, because in this case it's flowing water. But what's really elegant about this is these plants are built right next to the existing canal. The environmental impact of the water diversion, that's been felt since 1909, and it's, for better or worse, it's not going to go away. 80,000 acres aren't going to be dried up as a result of a cross-basin diversion today. So we get to sort of piggyback, if you will, onto an infrastructure that was put in place by putting hydro plants parallel to these channels. We don't consume water. It's non-consumptive use. The water is diverted anyway for irrigation use. The water quality is not impacted in any way. And it goes through our hydro plants, goes back into the canal, and is ultimately delivered for its agricultural purpose. That being the case, the financing of these projects and their economic viability is typically quite a challenge. These first 2 plants were putting the toe in the water, if you will, to see, can we find a way to viably finance them? Can they generate electricity at a cost point, a price point that is competitive with what we could purchase electricity at? And then ultimately, could we demonstrate that, in fact, we have the potential to do a lot more than 5% of the limits of our contract? And I would say on all those regards, the project was immensely successful. It is today our cheapest source of electricity. It has proven to generate kilowatt hours, the things that we sell, right, at a rate that exceeded our pre-engineering pro forma. And we were very fortunate because as a rural electric cooperative, we have access to funding from the federal government to fund the infrastructure that we would build on our distribution grid. But also in this case, there was a program that was referred to as clean renewable energy bonds. Because we're a not-for-profit utility, we don't have an income tax liability. And much of the incentive available to constructing renewable generation in general is tax-based. There's investment tax credit and production tax credits and such that pertain to wind and solar. There's even some tax credits that pertain to hydro. But the issue we had was, without having a tax liability, the tax credits weren't of any benefit to us in terms of deferring some of that cost. So the clean renewable energy bonds were offered through the federal government as a way to provide a financial incentive to develop renewable energy at these not-for-profit entities, rural electric cooperatives being one of them. And we had some extremely good terms in those clean renewable energy bonds that ultimately let us pencil this project out into this favorable price point we're at today. So I want to give kudos to incentives that are out there, in this case through the federal government, because they in fact did facilitate this initial project. The result of our success, so the plants, let me digress just a little bit, the plants began construction in the spring of 2012, and we used a fantastic contractor. I'll give them a plug. It was Mountain States Hydro out of the Pacific Northwest. And they won a bid through a request for proposal process. And without getting into the details too much, but we decided to go out for these proposals and what's called an engineer, procure, and construct contract, which means we were looking for contractors that would have the design capability, the procurement capability, and the construction capability, and we would deal with one general contractor. Again, this was interesting because it was at a time when hydro really had not seen a lot of development. The big dam projects had been done. The small hydro was not seen as economically viable, and so to find contractors that were actually versed in this particular type of construction and project was a little difficult. I think we were fortunate to find the Mountain States because they had some experience and we could actually go look at projects that they had completed. So the result was, and with about a year's time from March of 2012 till the 1st of June in 2013, our first plant came online. And in a couple months, August 1st, after that, the second plant came online. And our irrigation season was over by the end of October. We got a little taste of how things were going to go. Got our first full season in 2014, and frankly, we were delighted at how things were performing. And the result since has been we're in our now 2017 irrigation season. We've had some good snow years these last couple of years, which has been vital to the water resource that's available to us. And the plants have performed fantastically. The good news is after seeing the performance of those two plants and the potential that existed, we had some private developers come in and develop the next two drops that came online in 2015. And then we just last year, having partnered with the Irrigation Association that manages the facility for the Bureau of Reclamation, we agreed to purchase the power from a fifth drop that was developed by the Compadre Valley Water Users Association, the Irrigation Association that manages the project for the Bureau of Reclamation. So in total, we went from essentially fulfilling our 5% requirement to getting something that's a little bit more than about 3.5 times that in total capacity that's now on our grid. Now, there are some caveats to go to that total capacity that's on our grid. Those two plants that were developed in 2014, we do purchase the power from those plants, so they do go onto our grid, and the physics of electricity is such that they're serving our grid. But contractually and legally, we resell that power so that we can stay within that 5% limit of the contract. So we resell to another utility. It's called wheeling the power across our lines. And if you looked at an accounting of kilowatt hours generated and kilowatt hours consumed, even though the physics of electricity is the electricity gets consumed on our grid, contractually that electricity is sold to the Municipal Energy Agency of Nebraska, who is also a wholesaler, and they then wheel that power to one of their retail, their municipal utility districts that they serve, which in this case happens to be within the confines of our service area, but it's the city of Delta, which is its own municipal utility district. So a little bit of complex, detail on the marketing of electricity. And then what might be of some interest and maybe bring up some questions, the Drop 5 plant that came on in 2016, we did go ahead and negotiate a purchase power agreement with the water users, the developer of that plant. That power does come to DMEA, gets used on our grid, and is contracted to DMEA. And it's a little bit of a point of contention with our wholesale supplier, because the genesis of how that plant ended up being developed was before that plant was developed, there was another drop that a developer came and looked at and said, well, we want to develop this low head drop and we want to sell you the power. And we indicated that given our contract and our 5% limit, that would be a challenge. And they said, well, the 1978 law of PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, allows us as a qualifying facility, that is a renewable energy generation project, it allows us to sell to a utility that we want to interconnect to at that utility's avoided cost. And the law says you have to purchase it. Well, our wholesale supplier said, wait a minute, no, we actually have the obligation to purchase. So your purchase obligation is between the developer and the wholesaler, not the distribution cooperative. we read our wholesale contract, we looked at the PURPA law, and we concluded that, in fact, it looked like it was our obligation to purchase. That is the distribution cooperative's obligation. So we filed what's called a declaratory order with FERC and said, in essence, we asked, okay, who has the obligation? And so in June of 2015, FERC ruled that, in fact, DMEA, the distribution cooperative, has the obligation to purchase the power from the qualifying facility, and it has that obligation independent of the terms of its wholesale contract. And that was a big finding on the part of FERC, because it opened up this possibility that we could see a more diverse power supply. It could come from this 1978 law and these qualifying facilities, and we had a legal obligation to purchase it.
That's huge. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It is huge. It is amazing. Now, I think it has a couple of nuanced things about it that I am surmising, because it wasn't stated this way directly in the FERC ruling. I think the contract that we have with Tri-State is similar to the contract that 42 other cooperatives that Tri-State serves has. So I think it would be very specific to those co-ops. But not every co-op and their wholesaler have the same exact contract. And so I think there's some nuances in the contract that set this ruling up by FERC, but FERC did not come out and explicitly state that. But that being the case, it is huge because it could have impacts nationwide. It certainly has impacts in the 4-state area that the Tri-State cooperatives are served by. And what it says is, you know, these contracts that could be quite restrictive from between the G&T and the distribution co-ops now have a window open, if you will, for renewable energy, at least under the PURPA law, to get developed. And I think it offers an opportunity to some extent, because what's happened since that ruling is there's been a declining price in both the wholesale power market in general and the wind and solar, particularly renewable generation, that has come down in price in large part because of lower capital costs to build those facilities. And what's happening is developers of these renewable projects may not necessarily have willing buyers, because, you know, it's a price-driven market. And when you look at what distribution co-ops pay for their power, it's typically higher than what you see in the wholesale market. So there's this potential for a developer to come in, interconnect at the distribution cooperative level, and maybe find a price point that would be amenable to both the distribution co-op and the developer, where they wouldn't necessarily find that in an organized market or in a wholesale market, a G&T market that they might be trying to build and sell into. Now, interestingly enough, the wholesaler, Tri-State, said, okay, we get it. They have the obligation to purchase this power, but given the contractual nature of the G&T cooperative selling power, generating and transmitting power to sell to the distribution co-op, you know, we've always assumed that there would be this long-term relationship. And what's vital in that long-term relationship is that, you know, we go out and borrow money and fund the building of our generation and transmission facilities, assuming this contract would hold, and we would see, in the case of Tri-State and DMEA, 95% of that power being purchased from Tri-State and bought by DMEA. And what we said was, yes, but the way this contract's structured and the PURPA law has preceded the contract and said, you knew this obligation from a qualifying facility preceded your contract. And so you've always been at risk for a qualifying facility to come in and supersede the contract. And FERC clearly agreed. So what Tri-State in 2016 said was, okay, but even though they have the obligation to purchase, DMEA does, we have the right to recover revenue that we would have gotten. And so if they purchase from a qualifying facility, we can recover the revenue that we would have gotten by being displaced by this qualifying facility. And we were a little concerned because now financially, you know, if you purchase this power and now you've got an adder, so to speak, that you have to pay your G&T, it becomes economically unviable. So we opposed Tri-State's position, and it went before FERC, and FERC ruled that the revenue recovery mechanism that Tri-State had proposed, in fact, would undermine their 2015 decision. And so we felt pretty confident then that things are going to stand as we see them with FERC. And so we entered into the purchase power agreement with Drop 5. Now, what I perceive as a bit of an unfortunate development in this process with FERC, Tri-State then in, I think it was July or August of last year, petitioned FERC after they issued their second ruling saying, no, DMEA has that obligation and you can't do the revenue recovery. Tri-State said, well, we want you to rehear this revenue recovery issue. And FERC agreed to the rehearing, and then the unfortunate development has been that there are 5 commissioners that sit on the FERC board. At the time our issue was before them, they were down to 4. They then had a commissioner whose term was up and he was ready to leave. He then left, so they were down to 3. And then when the Trump administration took over, there was a resignation of a 3rd commissioner, so they're down to 2. So there's no quorum.
Right.
So this issue that's sitting there sort of in limbo is waiting for FERC commissioners to be named so that there can be a quorum and this can get resolved. Having said that, we're still out there with our purchase power agreement. We're complying with the law as it stands now. And so I think there is some opportunity for renewable energy to make its way onto the grid, even in these, what I would consider to be pretty restrictive contracts that exist throughout the country between rural electric co-ops and their wholesale.
And it seems like you have 2 mechanisms for doing that, both the wheeling of the power and this reinterpretation of the contract, or bypassing of that contract obligation.
I think that's correct, and we would probably want to clarify what the objective is. If a cooperative's objective is simply to have green power in its service area, then having that developed and interconnected, and then just wheeling it to someplace else they can sell it, that actually puts the green power in their service area for sure. And it's being generated locally, it's being consumed on that grid locally. Contractually, it is not that local co-op's power. They're selling it. But the fact is, that is green power in your backyard, if you will. Now, the issue there is it doesn't necessarily give you a price advantage, right? Renewable energy has dropped so much in price that, when you see what wind energy and what solar energy, and to a lesser degree, but certainly to the same degree, some of the small hydro can be generated at, that's a price advantage that would be an economic benefit to the local community, because instead of taking your wholesale power purchases, sending that money to some other location, wherever your G&T is located, you're literally putting that into the pockets of the local developer that's in your area. And if it's cheaper power, you could presumably end up with lower rates to your members in your co-op, and it's keeping money in their pockets. So the economic benefit, which is a major motivator by our board of directors, doesn't necessarily come to the surface if it's a wheeling situation, but certainly the green power benefit. I will say this, it's a pretty convoluted and complex market that has been set up for this whole electric utility industry. I actually worked in the solar industry before I came to work for my local co-op, and I never understood how complex a market we've created just to generate, transmit, and sell electricity. Some of that is the result of a complex grid that's completely interconnected for the whole country. And some of that, frankly, is an industry trying to protect its turf. The whole PURPA law came about because, in part, because the Carter administration wanted to open up the electric utility grid to independent power providers and give them access to it. In an odd way, it's perhaps doing that for the renewable sector more successfully, now than when the law was passed back in 1978. And I think a lot of that is because of the price points we're at with the renewable resources.